So this is the second lecture on stress. In this lecture, we're going to talk about some experiments that look at stress, some societal influences on stress, some coping mechanisms for stress, and some broader pictures about this issue. The first thing we're going to talk about is learned helplessness. Learned helplessness is a situation where animals, including humans, learn that their behavior doesn't control their environment. And in doing so, they generalize to other aspects of their life. So they don't control their situation in this event, they don't control it in other events or other situations as well. So this is Martin Seligman, and he did some of the first research on learned helplessness. In fact, he consulted with military officials about how learned helplessness affects people who are prisoners of war or torture, and what to do to counteract that. Well, let's look at the very first experiment. This is a very simple experiment. You have three groups of animals. These are dogs, in this case. One group is shocked, but they can press a lever to make the shock go away. Group 2 is yoked to Group 1. It's a yoked control. What this means is that when Group 1 gets shocked, Group 2 gets shocked. Group 1 can control when shock goes off, but Group 2 cannot. In fact, when it goes off for Group 1, it also goes off for Group 2. The third group doesn't get a shock at all. So here's our three groups. Group 1, Group 2, and Group 3. Now, here they are getting shocked, the poor animals. But Group 1 can press a lever and the shock goes off. Okay? So they get shocked. Group 1 presses the lever and it goes away. You can see how it goes away for the second group as well. Press the lever and it goes away. Then these animals, all three of them, were given other opportunities to do behavior. So they were asked to do an avoidance task. So a light comes on, they get shocked, and they escape the shock. In this case, they escape it, and light comes on, and they escape a shock. They eventually learn when the light comes on to avoid the shock. But Group 2 doesn't do this very well. Group 2, the light comes on and he gets shocked. He doesn't learn to escape this situation. In fact, he just takes a lot of shocks. And the idea is that the animal had learned in one situation that its behavior does not control its environment, so it generalizes that to other areas. This is an example of what a shocking grid might look like in a real case. That's what's called a shuttle box. The animal shuttles back and forth. So here's Group 1. Here's Group 1. The experimental animal got to shut off the shocks. Here's the third group, and it didn't get shocked at all. And here's that yoked control group. And these are how many times it failed to escape a shock that was perfectly escapable. This is also the latency of response. How quickly, when they in fact did escape, how long did it take them to learn to do this? And you can see the yoke control took a long time. He didn't control his environment in one case, and he applied that to others. So where do we see learned helplessness in our society? Well, it's very common in cases of abuse, spousal abuse, where an individual might get abused at home in a relationship. They might get physically abused, might get verbally abused, and a lot of times the question is, why don't they just leave? Well, in this case, the individual doesn't control their environment very well. They don't know when they're going to get abused in these ways. It's not predictable. And so if they can't control that, they don't control other things. We also see that with children. Children that get abused don't do well, obviously, in school, but they don't do well in school for a lot of reasons, and one of them is they don't control their environment at home. It's unpredictable at home, and so they don't control it when they're in school and other situations. This is what we oftentimes don't think about. We don't think about cases where you have a really bad boss. Now, we're with our bosses oftentimes more than we're with our family. And if the boss is abusive, and we've all probably experienced that, some power trip boss, we might have a hard time leaving that job, even though we should leave that job. We get more and more in a case of learned helplessness within our work. People don't think about that. I mean, my best advice to you is if you come into a new job, even if it's a good job, if you have a tyrannical boss, a tyrant, get out quickly or you get into situations where you're not able to. And another example is oftentimes in sexual abuse or in prostitution, and in cases like this, people ask, why do these people do these things with their body? And a lot of times the pimps or the situation gets them into a point where they can't control their environment. I remember hearing a report about this by a researcher at the University of Hawaii while I was there. And he looked into this case, and what he found was that people women who are turned into prostitutes, the pimps oftentimes start with a lot of control. Okay, they tell them that when they can go out, they tell them what friends they can see. They tell them everything, when they eat, everything. Soon as they control those aspects of their life, they can then control every aspect of this individual life. They even said they take prostitutes and they move them around a lot so they don't establish strong bonds and friendship. So what are some of the ideas? Well, one is just called the learned helplessness hypothesis. And it's the idea that it's a general loss of motivation, a decline in performance, and an increase in passivity. In other words, they just do whatever they're told to do, and they just lose motivation to do anything. It's more of a general theory. A generalized expectation that it's the animal's or a person's behavior will continue to be independent of reinforcing outcomes. In other words, doesn't matter what you do. You do this behavior, you still can get punished. Do this behavior, you still can get punished. And once you can't predict your environment, control your environment, that generalizes to many other things. Well, one possibility is it's not necessarily a lack of control. You don't control this part of your life. The little dog who doesn't control when the shock gets turned off. But it's more of a lack of predictability. You might not have control, but if you can predict things in your life better, then you don't get the learned helplessness. Predictable shock is less damaging than unpredictable shock for future avoidance. In other words, all you have to do is tell the animal when it's going to get shocked. He doesn't control it, but at least he knows when it's coming, and when it's going off, you don't see the learned helplessness. Stimuli following the offset of an inescapable shock eliminates the learned helplessness deficit. Here's an experiment. This is Jackson and Miner. Group 1 had escapable shock, just like in the Seligman experiment. They pressed the lever, the shock went away. Group 2 was yoked with a light going off when the shock went off. In other words, the light helped to predict when the shock was going to go off. So this is getting the same shocks as Group 1. This is the same yoke control as we saw before. The only difference is there's some predictability in its environment. Group 3 was like the yoked one originally in the original experiment. No predictability, no control. And of course, Group 4 had no feedback. So let's look at these results. No shock at all. The mean latency of escape is very quick. Escapable shock, they press the lever and they escape the shock. They do it pretty well. If they knew when the shock was going to turn off, they do pretty well. It's only when you can't control the shock, nor can you predict it, do we see this poor performance, this learned helplessness. So let's go over some other ideas. Maybe it's a stress thing. Maybe it's an anxiety circumstance. Inescapable shock produces anxiety. Chronic stress produces poor learning. We've talked about this before. Chronic, unpredictable, uncontrollable stress produces a stress response like cortisol. If this is chronic, we get problems with learning. Signaled shock there is a way to prepare for it. There's a preparedness. There is a safety period. And it doesn't produce the anxiety. We don't see the anxiety response. So it could have that cortisol diminishing learning capabilities. It could be just a stress situation that produces the inability to learn in the future. So, why do we like predictable stress events? Here's some ideas. In other words, why does a stressful event like shock not produce learned helplessness when it's predicted, not controlled but predicted? Why is that happening? Well, one is called the preparatory response hypothesis. If an aversive event is predicted, then the individual can prepare physiologically and psychologically. If this acute stress, you're about to get shocked, is coming, and you know it's coming, you have these responses to it that are actually rather healthy. Adrenaline, even endogenous opiates to deal with the pain, cortisol, which is good in the short term, and also you have the safety hypothesis. If you know when the shock is coming, and you know when the shock is going away, then you can relax at the other times. It's not the chronic stress. Remember, chronic stress is what causes a lot of cortisol and a lot of damage to the hippocampus. This is the stressful event is coming. There's preparedness for it. It's a bad thing. You deal with it. But when it goes away, you can get into the parasympathetic activity. You can get into a situation where you're not feeling that stress. You can relax and you don't have these chronic anxiety problems. So who experiences this kind of chronic stress? Remember, it's not only uncontrollability, but very importantly, unpredictability. Well, what about people who have post-traumatic stress disorder? Oftentimes produced by an unpredictable, uncontrollable, severe stressor. This can occur following the experience of witnessing life-threatening events. So people in the military, combat, you never know when the improvised explosive device is going to go off. A terrorist incident, sexual assault. These are all terrible things that are not predicted nor controlled. Post-traumatic stress disorder is a very serious thing. People who suffer from PTSD often relive the experience. Remember, the cortisol helps the hippocampus to be hyperactivated, and it can cause that memory to replay itself. And every time it replays itself, every time you remember that event, you go through the stress response again, producing cortisol, producing this anxiety. These are flashbacks. We even call these invasive thoughts in psychology because you can't get them out of your brain. And then people start feeling detached or estranged, and these symptoms can be severe enough to last a long time, even someone's lifetime. So who's at risk for post-traumatic stress? Well, people who are abused as children, 87%, it's almost guaranteed. People who survive a sexual assault, people who survive war, who are in that situation, Holocaust survivors during World War II. These were very high cases of PTSD. There was the Oklahoma City bombing, if you were around that event, severe assault, the 911 in New York City, the residents that lived there, the first responders, high cases of PTSD. And we also see a lot of correlation, so there's some genetic components to who gets PTSD and who doesn't, and that's the tough part, because it's very hard to predict who's going to get this. So you might be a very, very tough soldier and out in the field, and you get PTSD in a circumstance, but your comrade doesn't. And that only adds to exacerbate this problem. So we see a really high case of post-traumatic stress disorder happening in conjunction with other things. We get a lot of maladaptive behavior with PTSD. So high cases of depression, anxiety, self-medication, substance abuse, marital problems, difficulty in keeping jobs, doing well at jobs, controlling one's environment, so it's some learned helplessness going on there, but there's also some learning deficits, increased aggression and violence. We also see that this PTSD goes hand in hand with people who've been near an explosion. When there's been some head injury, these things go hand in hand as well. We also, have high cases of people with suicide with PTSD. These can be even higher numbers than people dying in battle. This came out in June 2004. It was really an article about what was happening in the Iraq War, and they were finding that when they surveyed about 2,500 soldiers that had been deployed and returned, they looked at them. They found that 15 to 70% met the criteria for depression, anxiety, and PTSD. Those numbers actually have gone up a little bit in further analysis, but only a small fraction of them seek treatment. This is that stigma of mental health and being a soldier. I think that the Army looks at this and says, well, we want to keep our soldiers. We want to keep our soldiers healthy. We want to keep our soldiers back in the field. And so they're trying to do a lot to give people treatment in the field. For example, if somebody has PTSD and you pull them out of their unit and you take them out of the war zone, that can be really damaging as well. They want to stay with their company. So to give them access to therapy within the field is very important. So the Veterans Administration, they found a lot of things that go with PTSD and some of the treatments. Treatments can be something like, serotonin reuptake inhibitors. These are antidepressants, and so a lot of antidepressants can help. Behavioral cognitive therapy with that helps. Sometimes with people who have head injuries, along with that, you have these anticonvulsive, also these benzodiazepines. These are sort of atypical antipsychotics, can help. A lot of times they need a lot of things. They need chemical help, and they need behavioral help, and they need cognitive help. This is an interesting experiment. This is a drug called propranolol. It's a beta blocker. It stops the activation or the influence of adrenaline. Adrenaline hypersensitizes the hippocampus, hypersensitizes that memory. It's really important that if this horrible event happens, that you remember that this event happened. But that can be too much. That you can get into the reoccurrence of those memories, the flashbacks over and over. Propranolol stops that from happening. It can actually affect the strength, really the emotional strength of a memory. The memory might still be there, but it doesn't have the emotional weight. Propranolol is a drug that affects memory and might be helpful in reducing post-traumatic stress disorder. So let's look at how stresses come about. One of them is really a cumulative effect of stressors. We're all good at dealing with that first stress of the day, right? The car cutting us off, we're a little late to work, one event. We can handle it. But when we have stressful events that occur in the same short amount of time period in a day, we get a cumulative effect. Each stressor is more stressful than the one that came before. We get sort of the straw that broke the camel's back analogy, the idea that it just builds up to a point where it can get very bad. Where do we see these kinds of things happening, these chronic stressors that we might deal with every day? Well, racism, sexism, bigotry, these are all sort of chronic stresses that can build up and be very damaging. So, if we look at the index of race-related stress, they broke it down into 4 kinds of stressors. There's cultural racism, number 1. Racism or bigotry that permeates our culture. This might be the way that people are portrayed in the media, in movies, in TV. the young black man in crime, that you see that maybe, or the person who is from Arab descent, they're terrorists, or this person is miserly with money, or whatever. These kinds of things that are constant, are presented constant in the news and the media, that is a cultural racism found within a society. There's institutional racism, how a single institution discriminates against a group of people. You might have cases where that we've seen in the United States. Well, what about the Institute of Marriage discriminating against gay people for a very long time? Or what about one society that doesn't allow some ethnic group to join their club? Then we have the individual racism that people experience. This is an event within a person's life, called a derogatory term, looked at funny. Some of these things are very subtle, and they are produced by people in subtle ways. The slight dirty look, the moving away from an individual that you don't trust, you move around them slightly. And that might be observed in very subtle, sometimes subconscious ways, and can be still damaging. And then we have collective racism. A person is categorized into a group, and so should accept all the attributes of that group. And this is the problem. This problem permeates. We generalize. That's what we do. All animals do it. Humans do it. We take examples of things in our environment, and we generalize to other things. So people of the same color, and people of the same ethnic background, and the same religion, and we assume that all people who have those attributes are just like that one time we saw that event, and we might not do this consciously. We might do this at a Pavlovian level, at a subconscious level, that we look at people and see people and act around people based on the way that they look, and that's a collective racism, and that's a hard thing to get at. Here's something that is of particular interest to me and to my wife: gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender gender discrimination. What we find is that while the United States is getting better and the world is getting a little bit better at this, this is a group of society that has been discriminated for a very long time. Students who are members of this group are 5 times more likely to miss school because of feeling unsafe. Discrimination at school, especially in adolescence. 28% are forced to drop out. Those numbers came from about 2010, so those numbers actually have improved a little. Lesbian, gay, and bisexual youth are at 4 times a higher risk of suicide than straight peers. This is a societal bigotry against individuals like this. A survey of 191 employers revealed that 18% would fire, 27% would refuse to hire, and 26% would refuse to promote a person who they perceived as lesbian, gay, or bisexual. Again, this came out in 2010, so hopefully these have been improved, but we still see these things creeping up in our society. This is a bigotry against individuals. When I was a teacher in Hawaii, my wife and I started what we called a safe zone. We promoted this for faculty members to put this up on the front of their door, just to show that their place was a safe place for people who were gay, lesbian, transgender, or transsexual. And we put on classes about how to communicate with people. I mean, for example, one thing you just don't do, somebody comes into your office and says, well, I'm gay and I'm having these problems, and then you come back with, well, have you tried being heterosexual? Have you tried not to be gay? This is ridiculous. It would be the same thing as asking heterosexual, listen, I see you're heterosexual, but have you tried to be homosexual? Have you given that a shot? This is a natural process. Homosexuality is as natural as heterosexuality. It is not as common, but we see it in just about all types of species, including mammals. So we fostered an environment on the campus we worked at of acceptance. We even started a gay-straight alliance of students. So let's look at some moderating variables that can help with stressors. So these are characteristics of the person's environment, their support system, or their personality. This is the genetic kind of components, or their learning, that help to moderate the effect of their stressors. So what are ways in which people appraise those stressful events? And this goes back to Richard Lazarus's work, he's at Harvard, on sort of how stressors are appraised, and it's also how they're internalized and incorporated. We appraise the events as negative or positive. It's one of the first things we do. Appraisal alters the meaning. There are two different categories of appraisal according to Lazarus's work. We have a primary appraisal. We see a stressful event, and we first decide, and this can be very quick, how stressful the event will be. Is it threatening? Is it harmful? Is it dangerous? Or is it a stress that is challenging? Is it controllable? Can you deal with it? Remember, not all stress is bad. Sometimes stress is good. You need a level of stress to get things done. And so the first appraisal is deciding really the context. The second appraisal is assessing the strategies that can meet the demand of the event. Well, I know it's threatening. What can I do to deal with it? I know it's challenging. What can I do? What can be done, given the circumstances, for the best possible outcome? Put the stressor in the right context. First, you appraise it about its threat level, about whether it's a challenge level, and then you appraise what to be done about it. So he did a lot of experiments, some of them kind of strange experiments, where he would show participants really kind of graphically violent videos. I remember this one where somebody gets their finger cut off in a shop, and and it all depends on the context he put it in. If he said, "Oh, this is a training video, and that's fake blood," so it's not where people would appraise it differently and not have the same emotional response to it as if it was talked about in a different context. Okay, so now we get into coping. We've talked about coping a little bit, but this is how we deal with the challenges that the stress brings. So there are a couple of ways of looking at this. There's problem-focused coping. This is more of a positive way, attempts to come up with solutions. I have this terrible event, or this stressful event, or this upcoming exam or test. Well, I have a problem. I'm gonna focus on the problem. I'm gonna solve the problem. But then we have the emotional focused coping. And this can be kind of negative. So problem focus is more of a positive way of looking at it. Problem focused. Emotional focus tends to be more negative. We cope with it by having these really stress responses and negative reactions to the stressful event. Oftentimes emotional focused coping can be really negative, but at times it can have some positive effects. But let's look at some of the bad things that happen. Well, you get into wishful thinking, you get into distancing yourself from it, or self-blame, or pointing your finger at somebody else, or self-isolation from these stress. These are all negative coping mechanisms. Maybe the emotion is to emphasize the positive part, look for health-enhancing behaviors, ways of coping at this that makes you feel good, but sometimes it can be really health-impairing. Especially if you internalize these things, or if you blame other people and you focus on the negative emotions of the event. So, one of the best ways to deal with stressful events is what's known as the buffering hypothesis. To buffer it, to make it less powerful, various social support buffer or protect an individual from harm of the potential stressor. So Cohen and Hoberman measured the degree to which social support, how many friends you have, how many people are there to help you, protect against stressful events for college students. And we can kind of walk through this. These are kind of the results of this experiment. These are the negative symptoms over here that they experienced. When the negative events were low, they're about the same. If you had high support in red or low support, it's about the same. Didn't matter. You can handle low stressful events, even without a lot of support. However, if the stress got bad, and we talked about some of the bad stresses, finals week, or the loss of a loved one, or the breaking up with a girlfriend or boyfriend, or the death of a pet, or moving, or some of these really high stressors, then when we get high support, it really makes a great deal of difference. Here is low support, a lot of bad things. But with high support in red, even a high degree of stress is manageable. This is depression symptoms, physical symptoms that they measured. It really helps to have that support, especially and primarily with high stressful events or cumulative stressful events. Okay, well, let's talk about humor. Some books and motivation talk about humor, so I never think they do a very good job. It's always very clinical, so I thought we would have just a little bit of fun with this. For example, there is a website that deals with doing research on what's funny. Research on what's funny. So they do a lot of surveys, they tell a lot of jokes, and they try to find out some experimental evidence of funny things. So I went through this website and I looked at some of the results of their findings. If you want to make a funny joke and use an animal in your joke, use a duck. Okay? The duck is the funniest animal according to this research. A duck walks into a bar and the bartender says, "Can I get you a drink?" And the duck says, "Sure, put it on my bill." Okay, it's funny. Here's the most submitted joke. What's brown and sticky? A stick. That's not the funniest joke. That's just the most submitted. The best joke length, 103 words. Statistically speaking, that's the best, funniest joke. So here's the world's funniest joke. Are you ready for the world's funniest joke? It's about 100 words. It doesn't have a duck in it, but it's still very funny. A couple of New Jersey hunters are out in the woods when one of them falls to the ground. He doesn't seem to be breathing. His eyes are rolled back in his head. The other guy whips out his cell phone and calls the emergency services. He gasps to the operator, "My friend is dead. What can I do?" The operator, in a calm, soothing voice, says, "Just take it easy. I can help. First, let's make sure he's dead." There's a silence. Then a shot is heard. The guy's voice comes back on the line. He says, "Okay, now what?" Funny joke. So what's interesting is to look at jokes that are funny or interpreted as funny as different parts of the world. Okay, so this is the funniest joke in Scotland. Scotland likes death and dark humor. "I want to die peacefully in my sleep, like my grandfather, not screaming in terror like his passengers." That's dark. It's funny, but dark. U.S. and Canada. Jokes where people are made to look stupid. This is what the U.S. likes. This is what Canada likes. So a Texan says, "So where are you from?" Harvard grad says, "I come from a place where we do not end our sentences with a preposition." Texan, "Okay, where are you from, jackass?" Okay, made to look stupid. Europe. They like gags that were surreal or made light of serious subjects such as illness, death, and marriage. Okay? They don't like the dumb humor. A patient says, "Doctor, last night I made a Freudian slip. I was having dinner with my mother-in-law and wanted to say, 'Could you please pass the butter?' But instead I said, 'You silly cow, you have completely ruined my life.'" I'm just letting you laugh before I move on to that. Well, that's all, folks.